The city was suffocatingly silent, an emptiness that carried weight in the air. Buildings loomed like hollowed-out tombstones, their shattered windows reflecting the dim, ash-gray sky. Jay walked down the abandoned street, the sound of his boots muted against the dust-laden pavement. He forced himself to breathe evenly, counting each step to keep the panic at the edges of his mind. There were no moans, no shuffling, no immediate signs of the dead, but that was what unnerved him most. Somewhere out there, just beyond the periphery of his senses, they waited, patient and unhurried, as though the city itself were alive and conspiring to keep him trapped. He ducked into a narrow alley, the long shadows twisting into shapes that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Inside the claustrophobic space, the smell of mildew and decay crept into his nostrils, making his stomach churn. A distant creak echoed from somewhere above, perhaps a shifting piece of metal or a dislodged brick, but in his mind it was so much worse. His grip tightened on the crowbar in his hand, his only weapon, though he doubted it would do much good. The thought hit him then, sharp and unyielding. The zombies weren't the worst part. The worst part was being alone in a place that no longer felt indifferent, but actively hostile, as though it knew his every weakness and reveled in dragging him deeper into despair. Jay reached an abandoned convenience store, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly as if they too were hanging on to the last shreds of life. Once inside, he tried to focus on scavenging, but the rows of half-empty shelves only reminded him of everything slipping away. Normalcy, hope, humanity itself. As he reached for a dusty can of soup, he caught movement in his peripheral vision, a blur darting between the aisles. Pivoting sharply, his heart thundered as he stared down the empty row. His hands trembled. He wasn't ready to fight. But nothing emerged, only the distant hum of the flickering lights and the oppressive weight of the silence. His mind whispered doubts, fueling the paranoia. Was something there? Or was solitude corroding the edges of his sanity? By the time he stepped back outside, the light had shifted, casting the city in an eerie crimson glow as the sun bled into the horizon. The stillness was absolute now. No wind, no distant sounds, just him and the vast, unyielding quiet. He forced his legs to carry him forward, his shadow elongating and twisting unnaturally against the cracked asphalt. In every window he swore he caught glimpses of movement, silhouettes that vanished the moment his eyes tried to pin them down. It was as if the city itself was watching him, teasing him with fleeting glimpses of his pursuers, if they even existed. Jay knew then, with a sinking, nauseating certainty, that escape wasn't about outrunning the undead. It was about surviving the slow unraveling of his mind in a city that wanted to consume him whole. Jay's footsteps slowed as the crimson light deepened, bleeding into every crevice of the hollow streets. The city exhaled around him, long and patient. It pulled at him, invisible threads tightening with every step forward. The silence wasn't just emptiness. It was aware. Under the skeletal remains of a collapsed overpass, his reflection flickered across the window of a rusted car. Jay barely glanced at it, until he noticed something strange. The reflection wasn't moving. Jay stopped. His breath caught as he leaned closer to the glass. His reflection stood there, perfectly still, head tilted just slightly too far to the left. Jay stepped away. The reflection did not. A knot twisted in his stomach. He turned sharply and walked faster, resisting the urge to look back. The crowbar felt heavier in his hands now. Keep moving. Don't stop. He passed hollow buildings where shapes shifted behind curtains, vanishing before his eyes could confirm them. The road split at the end of the block, one path swallowed by shadows, the other stretching toward a narrow bridge over the empty riverbed. Jay took the bridge, metal grated beneath his boots, groaning with each step. Halfway across, his gaze drifted downward. He shouldn't have looked. Below, pale figures stood in the dry riverbed. Dozens. They faced him, heads craned upward. Their eyes were hollow pits, and yet Jay felt their gaze like a weight pressing into his chest. One figure shifted, its head tilted in the same unnatural way his reflection had. Jay's pulse pounded in his ears, his vision tunneled. He stepped backward, heart racing, and the bridge creaked. The sound echoed across the city, louder than it should have been. Jay froze. In the riverbed, every head snapped upward at once, faces locked onto him. Jay ran. The bridge rattled beneath his feet, but he didn't stop until he reached the far end. Ducking into the nearest building, he shoved the door closed behind him. Inside, the air was stale and thick. Dust clung to every surface. Desks and chairs lay scattered as if people had left in a hurry long ago. Jay's flashlight flickered as he swept it across the room. And then, footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoing from behind. Jay didn't turn. He forced himself to breathe evenly, gripping the crowbar tighter, but the footsteps continued. They circled slowly, dragging across the floor. Finally, Jay spun around, raising the weapon, but no one was there. His chest heaved. He stepped backward, his heel brushing against something solid. He glanced down. The reflection in the glass window at the far end of the room was staring at him again, but this time it was standing behind him. Jay's breath hitched. He turned around, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the glass, the reflection had moved closer. It smiled. Jay swung the crowbar, shattering the window. The reflection broke apart, scattering across the floor in jagged shards. For a moment, silence returned. Then, in the fractured glass, dozens of reflections stared up at him from the pieces on the floor, each with hollow eyes. Jay didn't scream. He didn't have the time. Jay stood frozen, staring down at the countless hollow-eyed reflections staring back at him from the shattered glass. They didn't move, but he felt them, each fragment pulling at the edges of his mind, unraveling him thread by thread. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. The crowbar slipped from his fingers, landing with a dull clang on the dusty floor. He knelt slowly, reaching for one of the larger shards. The sharp edge caught the faint crimson glow, filtering in from the cracks in the building, glinting like the tip of a knife. Jay's hand trembled as he lifted it. The reflections watched. In the glass, his face stared back, eyes hollow and distant, the lines of fear and exhaustion etched deep into his skin. It didn't even look like him anymore. His battle for sanity had stretched too long, pulled too thin by the weight of solitude and shadows that whispered where no one stood. The city wasn't going to kill him. It never had to. Jay pressed the shard to his throat. There was no hesitation. As the glass slipped across his skin, he sank forward, folding into the silence like he had always been a part of it. The reflections in the shards blinked once, then they smiled.